All right, guys, so before we jump back into our code, I want to talk a little bit about the GitHub REST API and just make a couple requests and show you what we get back, because that's what we'll be doing from our application. So as you can see in the docs here, there's a URL at api.github.com, and basically we can make a request to different endpoints. For instance, /users will give us a list of specific users. If we want a single specific users, we can do that /users and then that username. You can also get, like in this case, they're getting the organizations, but you can get their repositories, basically any publicly accessible data. So I'm going to open up Postman, which is just an HTTP client, and if you want to follow along, you can get this at, I think it's getpostman.com, or you can just use your browser. It's just a GET request. And let's make a request to https and then api.github.com/users. And that's going to give me an array of users. And you can see the data I get from this particular endpoint is really just the username or the login, and then a whole bunch of other endpoints to get certain things. For instance, if I want to get all of their repos, I could hit this endpoint. If I want to get their gists or their followers, we have all these different endpoints that we can hit. Now, if you want to get a specific user, you can do user / and then I'll just use mine here. And we'll make that request, and that's going to give me all that same stuff, all the URLs, but it's also going to give me some extra data here, like name, company, blog, location, bio, my Twitter username, the number of repositories and gists, followers, all that stuff. So this is the stuff we're going to be displaying in our application. Now, we also want search functionality, so the endpoint for that is actually search/users, search/users, and then we add on a query param with question mark and then q equals and then whatever you want to search. So I'll just put Brad, and that's going to give me all of the items or all the users that match Brad, including my own username right here. Okay, so I also want to show you that if we go to the headers here, the response headers, the search endpoint, different endpoints have different rate limits. The rate limit is basically the amount of requests you can make during a specific amount of time. So in this case, I believe it's 10 per minute you can make. And you can see we have 9 remaining in the current minute. If I send again, we have 8, 7, 6. Now, if you want to up this rate limit, you can create a personal token or an API token. And you can use this API without any kind of authentication at all. We're doing it right now, but you do have lower rate limits. So we're actually going to create a token that we can use to up this a little bit. So to do that, you want to go to GitHub and then just go to settings. And from settings, you can go down to developer settings and then personal access tokens. And then from here, we want to generate a new token. You can put a note in here. I'm just going to say test. I'm going to delete this after, so don't use mine. And you can choose an expiration or you can choose no expiration. And then there's all different scopes that you can choose for this particular token. In our case, we want user. Okay, I'm going to click on user and also repo because we are going to get the user's repositories. And I believe that should be all that we need to do here. And then let's do generate token. And then we can copy it. And I just want to show you real quick. If I go back to Postman and remember how we have these, if I send again, we're going to have 9 left, right? Because it's per minute. But if I go to authorization and I include this token by going to bearer token and then pasting this in, if I send again, and now if we look at the rate limit, it should go up. So now we have 30 per minute. Okay, so without the token, we have 10. If we include the token, we have 30. So I do want to include the token within our application, so we might as well just add that right now. So we'll go into VS Code, and we want to create something called an environment variable. So this is a variable that we can use anywhere in our application, and we can do that by creating a new file called .env. Okay, .env. Now, even though we're storing this in a .env file, anything that we put in here, all these global variables, are embedded into the build, meaning that anyone can view them by inspecting our client-side files. All right, so you don't want to put really sensitive information in here. In fact, if I were making this a production app, I would probably have my own server where I would keep the key or the token, and then I would make a request to my own server, and then from my server make the request to GitHub. But we're just going to store it here. I mean, you don't even have to have the API token. If you want, you can completely remove it and it will still work. You'll just have a lower rate limit. Now, to use an environment variable here, we have to do React_app_, and then we can call it whatever we want. So in this case, I'm going to call it GitHub token. All right, and then I'm going to store that here. Another thing I'm going to store is the GitHub API URL, which I don't think is going to change anytime soon, but just in case, we'll go ahead and store that here. We'll call it GitHub URL, and we're going to set that to https api.github.com. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save that. And now we should be able to access these. In fact, we'll go ahead and test it out. I do believe you have to restart your server when you add an environment variable like that. So let's restart. And then let's see, let me just, so let's go to we'll go to the home component. And I just want to see if we can access this. So I'm just going to output here process.env. And then we'll do React_app_GitHub_token. Okay, so you can see that we are now getting the token. So anywhere in our application, we get access to this environment variable. And when we're going to want to use that is when we make a request to GitHub. Okay, just like we used it in Postman, we used it in the authorization here. We're going to do that from our application. Okay, so that gives you an idea of how the GitHub API works. We have the different endpoints we're going to hit. Ultimately, we're going to make our requests all from the GitHub context that we're going to create. Although for the first couple videos, we'll just make a request right from the component so that we can make sure everything works, and then we'll move it to the context. Okay, so in the last video, we took a look at the GitHub API and we made some requests from Postman. Now we want to start to think about making those requests from our app and displaying the data. So ultimately, we're going to have a GitHub context where we keep all of our state. We have all of our functions that make our requests. But for now, we'll just do it from the component. I want to start with the UserList component, which is basically going to be the results when we make our search, the results that we get back, and we're going to display on the home page. So let's go to components and let's create a new folder. Right now we have a layout folder. This new folder I'm going to call users. Okay, so actually that shouldn't be in layout. We want that alongside of layout. So we should have components, you have your layout, and then you have your users folder. So in users, let's create a file here called user. I was going to call it user list, but I guess user results makes more sense. So we'll call it user results. And let's go ahead and create a React component. And just for now, we'll just output user results. And where we're going to put this is on the home page, right? We don't want to put it right in the app.js because we have routes. If we put it in the app.js, it's going to be on every page, the about page, the not found page. So let's go to our home page. And then let's bring in, we're going to import user results, and then we'll come down here and we can get rid of this H1 now, and let's just embed our user results. Okay, so we should just see this for now. And we can actually get rid of the div, just have a fragment here, and just display the user results. And I'll put a comment here because search, we'll say search component will go here. But we can close up the home page for now, and let's go back to our user results component. And ultimately, we want to make the request from the context, the GitHub context, but we haven't created that yet. Right now, I just want to get the users displayed. So let's make a request from this component. And since we want to make it right when the component loads, we want to bring in the useEffect hook. So let's say import useEffect, and we're bringing that in from React. Okay, so we want to go down here into the component now, and let's call useEffect. And useEffect takes in a function, and it also takes an array of dependencies. And in this case, the array is going to be empty because we have no dependencies. We just want it to load when the component, or run when the component loads. So in here is where we want to make our request. So let's say const, And let's say, actually, you know what? We have to create a separate function. Since I'm using async await, we need to have a separate function or asynchronous function. So let's go down here and let's say const, we'll call this fetch users. And let's say async. And then we'll make our request from here. So let's do const res or response. And let's set that to await fetch. Okay, so we're making a fetch request, and let's actually put template string in here. And we want to get the GitHub URL. Remember, we have that in our process.env.react_app_GitHub_URL. So that's our GitHub URL. And we want to do let's do /users, okay? Because the search, ultimately we're going to do the search endpoint, but /users gives us the same type of data, so we can work with this for now. Now I do want to include our token, and the way we do that is we include it in the authorization header. So we can pass in a second argument here into fetch and pass in an object with our headers, and then we can set authorization, and we can set that to let's put it some backticks, and we do token space and then our GitHub token, which we can get from process.env. It's going to be React app GitHub token. Okay, so that will send the token along with the request. Now let's go under the response. So the fetch ends here under the response, and let's say const data, and let's set that to await response.json, and that should give us the data. So for now, let's just console log the data, and we want to run this fetch users right now is just defined. We want to run it up here, fetch users. All right, so let's save that, and let's go over here and open up our console, and you can see we get an array. I guess it gives us 30 users. So we have an object, and it has all the stuff we saw in Postman, the login. What we're really interested in here is just the login name and the avatar URL, which we should have somewhere in here, right here, avatar URL, so we can display an image of the user. Now we're gonna put the users into a piece of state into this component. So in order to do that, we need to bring in useState. So let's go down here, and we know how to use useState, right? We do const with in some brackets. We'll do users and then set users and set that to useState, and the default will just be an empty array. We're going to fill that with the users we get from the API. In addition to that, let's do a loading state too. Whenever you make a request to an API, you should have some kind of loader. So I'm going to make this true by default, and let's say loading, and then set loading. Now you can do it in a couple ways. I like to set it to true, and then once we make the request and get the data, set it to false. Or you could set it to false by default, and then right before you make the request, set it to true, and then set it to false. But I just assume keep it true to begin with. All right, now what we'll do is down here, instead of just console logging the data, let's go ahead and set users to that data. Actually, let me see, is it just, yeah, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't in some kind of array called data or items or anything like that. So we just want the array that we're getting directly, setting it to users. And then we'll go ahead and set loading to false. Okay, and then down here in the return, we should be able to basically create a list to map through all the users and then output the ones that we want. Now I do want to give this, I'm going to actually have quite a few classes in here because I'm going to use the grid. So we have a class of grid, and I want it to be responsive too. So we have a couple responsive classes that we're going to use in here. So we have grid. Let's do grid dash calls dash 1. We'll give it a gap gap of 8. And then on extra large screens, so extra large colon, we're going to have 4 columns. So grid dash calls dash 4. On large screens, so LG colon, we're going to do 3. So grid dash calls dash 3. And then on medium, so MD, we're going to do 2. So grid dash calls dash 2. We're just setting a different number of columns based on the screen size. All right, now in here, let's get rid of user results. And since we have users in our state, let's go ahead and just put in some curly braces, and we'll take our users and we'll map through those. So let's say in here we'll have a function and we want to return some JSX. So I'm going to put another set of parentheses, and we'll say for each user. And ultimately, I'm going to want a specific component for this called user item. But for now, let's just do an H3. And we'll put in user dot, and we should be able to get, I think it's, yeah, login. So let's try that. We'll save. And there we go. So now we're seeing all the user logins. And it should be in a grid. So if I expand this, you'll see we get 4 columns, 3, 2, 1, and we should check to see if it's loading, if the request is loading as well. So let's go up here and let's just say if not loading, then we'll go ahead and move this return. We'll move that up into there. Else, for now, let's just put H3. H3, and it's not working. It's H3, and then loading, dot, dot, dot. We'll add a spinner. Wait, what is going on here? Oh, I forgot my return. That's why nothing's working. All right, so if I reload, we should see loading real quick. Yeah, you can see it right in the middle here. Yep. So before we move on to creating our user item for each one that has the avatar and some styling, let's do the spinner in the next video. Okay, so now I want to just create a spinner component, because when I reload here, you can see it just says loading right now. So I have a pretty cool looking spinner here that I found that I want to use. So I'm going to create in layout a new folder here called assets. And then I'm going to put that spinner in there. And obviously you can get this from the GitHub repo. Okay, now we need to create a spinner component, so that's going to go in layout as well because it's it's part of our layout. So let's create a file here called spinner.jsx, and we want to bring in the spinner image. So let's import spinner from, and that's going to be, let's see, just dot slash, right? Where are we? We're in layout, so we just want /assets/ spinner.gif. Okay, and then let's see, as far as what we want to return here, this div, I'm going to give a class of w. Let's do w-100, that's width 100, and then let's do margin top 20. And then we'll have our image in here. The source is going to be the spinner. And for alt, we'll just say loading. And I'm going to add a width as well. So let's add a width here of, let's do 180. And let's do class name. We're going to set text-center, and we're going to set mx auto, margin auto. And that should do it. So let's bring that now into user results. So import spinner. And then instead of down here, instead of the loading right here, let's put our spinner component. Let's see what, oh, this should be a lowercase s right here. Okay, so now you can see spinner flashes real quick. Looks kind of cool. And yeah, so that's it for that. Now in the next video, what we'll do is replace this H3 with a user item. And I mean, I know right now we're fetching data right within the component, but later on when we move it to the context, all this stuff is going to stay the same. The JSX, the output here, and in the user item that we're going to create in the next video are all going to stay the same. We're just going to be fetching the data from somewhere else. All right, so I just want to kind of, we're just basically taking it step by step. So in the next video, we'll get to the user item. Okay, so now we're fetching our users from the user results component, which again, this is going to be moved to context later, but just to kind of get them displayed, we're fetching them here. And then down here we have a list. We're outputting each login in an H3. So what I want to do now is replace this H3 with a user item component. So let's go into components, and then in the users folder, let's create a file called useritem.jsx. Okay, and just for now, we'll just output user, because what I want to do is bring this into the user results component. So let's do that. So this is in the users folder, and then slash user item, and then let's replace down here. Let's replace where we have this H3. We're going to get rid of that, and let's output user item. That's going to take in a key. So for the key, let's use the, we'll just do the user ID, and then we want to pass in that particular user. Like that. So now we're gonna see user for all of them, because that's what we have in our user item component. So in here, let's take in the user, and we might as well add our prop types while we're at it. So let's do that. Go down here, say user item dot prop types, and we're gonna set user, and that's going to be prop types dot object and is required. So we should be able to get now, let's just make sure, we should be able to get the user dot login, and we should be able to output that. Now all I want from this user object is the login and the avatar URL. So I could just destructure here, and let's just take out the login and the avatar underscore URL. And then I should be able to just do, login and avatar URL. So that's going to give us the same thing. Now we're going to have quite a bit of styling for this component. So if you want to just copy it from the repository, you can, or we can just type it out. So let's start off with this wrapping div here. We're going to give it a couple classes. So we're going to use the card class, which is part of Daisy UI. We're going to give it a shadow. Let's do shadow medium, compact. We're also going to add side, and then the background, which is going to be BG base -100. We can keep the login in there for now. So now we should see the shadow here. All right, now inside that, we're going to have another div, and this is going to be a flex box. It's going to be a row, so let's do flex row. We're going to do items center. That will align items center. Let's do space dash x dash 4, and let's do card dash body. Okay, and we want the login. Actually, we'll just get rid of this for now. All right, so in here, in this flex box, we're going to have two items which are going to be divs. So I'm going to have one div and another. And in this first div here, we're going to have another div with the class of avatar. And then let's do another div with the class of rounded dash full. And let's do shadow, and we're going to do width dash 14 and height dash 14. And then in that div we'll have our image, and the source is going to be the avatar URL that we get from the user. Let's see, avatar URL. And for the alt, we'll just put profile. So that's the image, and that's the first div in the flex box. Now down here in this div, let's go ahead and add an h2, and we're going to give this the class of card-title. And in here is where we're going to have the login, or the username, whatever you want to call it. And then we want to have a link that goes to the specific user page, which doesn't exist yet, but it will. So let's go up here and let's import our link. So we want to import link from React Router DOM, and then down here, let's add our link. And I'm going to give it a couple classes. So let's say class name, we're going to do text dash base dash content, and then make it, we're going to add a little transparency. So let's say text opacity 40. And then for the two, actually let's just close this link, and this is going to say visit profile. Now for the two here, this is going to be dynamic, so we actually want to make this curly braces, and inside the curly braces we'll have some backticks, and the link is going to be /user/ and then the username or the login. So it'll be like that. And there we go. So that looks pretty good. So if I click on the link, obviously that's not going to work because we haven't created that yet, but it should go to /, and then the username. And right now it's just getting the first, 30 users, starting with the first user with the ID of 1, but later on this is going to be our search results. But I think that looks pretty good in terms of the UI. It's responsive. Cool. So now that we at least have the users and the user item components, in the next video, let's go ahead and move this right here. Right now we just have the state for the users right in our user results. We don't want that. We want to move the state to a context, and also this request here we'll make from the context. Ultimately, we're not going to need this fetch users, but again, it returns the same thing that search users returns in terms of like the fields and the objects. So we'll just use this for now, but we're going to move it to context in the next video. All right, guys, so right now we have our state, our users, and our loading state right in the user results component, and we're also fetching our users from here. And ultimately, that's not what we want to do. We want to move this to a global context. Now, we're going to do this a little bit different than we did in the first project. In the first project, we just used the useState hook from within our context, and we set our state that way. In this project, I want to introduce to you something called reducers, which are basically functions that we can use to manipulate our state. And if you have a lot of state and you plan on scaling your application, then you should definitely use reducers. And then you also have the option to use a third-party state manager like Redux, which also uses reducers. If you've ever worked with Redux, then you probably already know what reducers are. But these days, where you have the context API and then you have hooks like useContext and useReducer, I don't really see a need for Redux unless it's a really large application with a lot of state, and where it can get messy. Just using the context API, you might have to reach for a third-party solution. But in most cases, I would say just stick to React and stick to the context API and the hooks that are offered. So before we get into reducers, I'm just going to create a global context and kind of do things how we did in the first project with useState, and then I'll show you in the next video how we can start to use reducers. So let's go into our source folder. Let's create a new folder called context, and then I'm going to have a new folder in context called GitHub, because you can have multiple contexts. In this particular app, we're going to have our GitHub context, and later on we're going to have an alert context for alert messages. So in GitHub, let's create a new file, and we're going to call that GitHub context.js. And we can go ahead and close the user item. That's all set. We will need to edit this user results because we'll need to fetch this stuff from our context, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So from here, let's import create context, and we don't want that from Jest. We want that from React. And let's just close the sidebar here. So import create context, and then let's go ahead and create a variable here called GitHub context, and we're going to set that to create context. And then we're going to need the GitHub URL and the token from our environment variables. So I'm going to put those in regular variables. So I'm going to create this GitHub URL and get that from process.env and then it's under React app GitHub underscore URL, and then we want to do the same for the token. So let's change this to token, and let's change this to token. Now, if you remember from the first project, we need to export a provider function. So let's say export const, and we'll call this GitHub provider. And that's going to take in props, and we want the children from that, which is basically whatever we surround with the provider. And then let's also bring in use state. And like I said, ultimately we're going to use useReducer and use reducers, but for now we'll just use state like we did in the first project. And then in the next video I'll show you how we can implement reducers. So let's go ahead and we can actually copy these two for now. So basically I'm just taking exactly what we have in user results and moving it to a global context. So we have that, and then let's also get fetch users. So this function right here, we're going to take that and put that in the provider as well. Except now that we have these variables, let's just get rid of the process env and the React underscore app underscore. So this will be token and then just GitHub token like that. All right, so we have our fetch users, and we're getting the data, we're setting the users, setting loading back to false, or I should say setting it to false. And then what we want to return from this, let's go under, make sure you're out of the fetch users but still within the provider, and we're going to return from this GitHub context.provider. Okay, and then children, the children that's passed in is going to be output here. And then any values we want to pass down to components will go in this object, which in this case will be users and loading. Okay, so yeah, I think that should be good for now. Actually, we need to export the context. So let's export as default GitHub context. Now we need to wrap our components in our app.js. So let's go to app.js, and from here let's import we want to import the provider. So GitHub provider, we're going to import that from, and then that's, let's see, we're in the root here, so it's going to be in context slash GitHub slash GitHub context. And then remember, we have to wrap everything that we want to use. If we want to use anything in that provider, we have to wrap it. So let's go to the top level here and wrap in GitHub provider. Okay, so we just want to take that, and that's going to wrap everything. So now we should have access to the data in the context. Let's go ahead and open up our DevTools, and let's go to the React DevTools components, and you should see this GitHub provider here, and we're passing in the state. So we have the users, which right now is an empty object, and then we have the loading, which I set to true by default. So let's now go into user results, and instead of doing everything from here, we just want to bring in what we want to use. In fact, I forgot to pass down, in addition to the users and loading state, we want to pass in fetch users. Okay, it's because we want to call that from our user results. So now from our user results, let's see, we're going to get rid of the state because that's now in the context. We're going to get rid of the fetch users because that's in the context. So get rid of that. And then what we want to bring in is, first of all, use context. We no longer need use state, so let's just say use context. And then we want to bring in the GitHub context. So let's import GitHub context, and let's see, we're going to go into the function here, and then remember how this works. We pull out what we want from the context. So we just pass in our GitHub context here, and we can take out any of these values, which in our case, we're going to go ahead and we're going to bring in all of those. So let's do users, loading, and fetch users. Now fetch users, I'm just kind of using just as an example to at least get some users showing. Ultimately, these are going to be the users we search for through the search form. Okay, now we already have our use effect, and we're already calling fetch users when the component loads, so that's good. And then down here, we already have our list using users, only this time it's coming from our context. Same thing with loading. Okay, so we've essentially just moved everything from here into our context. So now let's save that. And now you can see that we're getting the same, it's displaying the same thing, but everything has been moved to the context. If we check our components, if we look at the GitHub provider, now if we look at the state, it's no longer an empty array, it's full of those user objects. All right, so in the next video, I want to switch from just this use state in our context to creating reducers, which are functions to manage our state. So we'll get into that next. Okay, so now we're going to implement reducers, and reducers, they're actually really easy, but just the concept of them can be a little tough to wrap your head around at first. So this article, this is by Robin, I'm not even going to try to pronounce their last name, but it's a pretty good article to look at and learn about reducers. Now, as it says here, reducers became popular in JavaScript with the rise of Redux. Now, Redux is a third-party state manager and was really popular with React, and I guess it still is, but it's less popular now that we have the context API and we have some hooks like useContext and useReducer. Personally, I'd only reach for Redux if it were a really large application and it was too much, the state was just too much to manage with context. So maybe like a really large e-commerce site where you have products and categories and users and all types of carts and things like that. Now, if you've used Redux before, then you know what reducers are. So if we look at this article here, let's see. So it says a reducer is a function which takes two arguments. Those two arguments are going to be the current state and an action. And the action is typically an object that has a type, and the type is basically just a string that you can evaluate. And then it might have a payload. For instance, if it's an action to update a blog post, you would include the post itself as a payload in that action object. So let's go down and look at an example. So here's an example of a reducer function. It takes in the initial state, in this case is just count, and then an action, which is going to be an object that has a type. As you can see here, we're looking at action.type. And the type is typically just going to be a string. In this case, it's increase. So we're going to evaluate that action type and say if it's equal to increase, then we're going to return count +1 as the new state. If it's decrease, then we're going to return count -1. Now, usually you won't use if statements. You usually use a switch like this. So again, we're passing in the initial or the current state, and then the action, and then we're just evaluating the action type using a switch. If the case is increase, we return +1, decrease -1, and then we have a default where we just return count if it's if it doesn't have an action that matches these. All right, so that's kind of the structure of a reducer function, and you can go on to read more about it here. But let's jump into our application. And we want to now create a specific file for our reducers, for our GitHub context reducers. So in the context GitHub folder, I'm going to create a new file called GitHub Reducer.js. Okay, so this is where all of our reducers will go that are related to the GitHub state. So let's create a function. We'll call it GitHub Reducer. And it doesn't have to be an arrow function. I'm just choosing to use one. And what this will take in is going to be the current state and also an action. And the action is typically going to be an object that has a type, and the type is just a string, just like we saw in the article. It was a string of increase, you had decrease, so it's just going to be a string. And then if there's any data, like if we're getting users or updating a user, then you would send a payload as well in that object. So here we want to evaluate the action type, and we do that with a switch. So action dot type. Now you could use an if statement, but you might have a ton of actions, so that could get kind of messy. So it's convention to just use a switch, and then you would have your different cases. Now I'm not going to add a case just yet because I want to show you how we can actually dispatch an action, but we will have a default here, and the default is just going to return the current state as is. If there's no action, then you don't want to change the state. You're just returning this is the current state. So I'm gonna we need to export this. Let's export default GitHub reducer. Okay, and I'll leave it at that for now, and then let's jump over into our GitHub context and let's close up the sidebar. So since we're using reducers now, we're not going to be using useState. We're going to use useReducer. Okay, so we'll add that. Now we have to import our GitHub reducer. So let's bring that in, and then let's go down into our provider function here, and where we have this useState for users and loading. We're no longer going to need this. What we're going to do is create an initial state and set that to an object, and we'll have users, which by default will just be an empty array. We'll fill it after we make our request, and then also let's have loading, and we could set that to true by default. Then what we want to do is use the useReducer hook. So let's do const, and just like useState, it's going to destructure and give us an array, or we're destructuring from an array. And here we want to say useReducer, and this takes in two things. First of all is the reducer we're using, which in our case is the GitHub reducer, and then it also takes in the initial state, okay, that we just defined right here. And then what we get from this is going to be two things: the state, and we have a method called dispatch, or a function called dispatch. Kind of like we have from useState, we have set whatever that piece of state. Only what this is used for is to dispatch an action to our reducer, which we haven't defined any in here just yet. We just have the default, but we can define actions in here, or action types, and we can dispatch them from wherever we want in this file. So where we want to dispatch is down here. Instead of just set users and set loading, we no longer have those available to us because we're not using the useState hook. Instead, we want to dispatch, and this takes in an action object. So we're going to pass a type, and a type is just going to be a string, all uppercase. So let's say get users, right? So we're going to dispatch that to the GitHub reducer. So in here, we want to say case, and it's going to be a string of get underscore users. And then from here, we want to return some type of state. Now remember, we have the current state right here. So usually what we'll do is we'll spread across anything that's already in the state. Okay, so that's just going to return the current state. It's basically doing the same thing that we're doing here, except we defined an object and we just manually spread across whatever's already there. Now for get users, what do we want to do? What do we want to change? If we look at our initial state, we have users and we have loading. So we want to fill the users array with the users from the API, right? And then we also want to set loading to false instead of true. So we're passing the type, which is fine, but we also need the data. So we send that as a payload. So we're going to say payload, and that's going to be the data we get from the API. All right. So now if I save that, this is just going to break until we finish this up. But now we're dispatching the type get users and sending the data as payload. So in here, what we want to return is whatever's already in the state, but then we want to update users to be the action.payload. Okay, and I could call this something else. I could call this users, and then this would be action.users, but payload is I guess the convention. So we also want to set loading, and we want to set that to false. All right. So let's go ahead and save that. And there should be one last thing we need to do for this to work, and that's in our context where we're returning down here the provider. Instead of just users, we're going to go ahead and pass in state.users, right? Because now we're dealing with the state, we're dealing with this right here, okay? And the dispatch is updating that state, so that's what we want to pass down to the components. Same here, state.loading. And if we save that, now it works. Okay, so we've switched from just putting the state into these use state values. We've switched to now having these reducers that we can dispatch actions to and have those actions from this function update the state in whatever way we want. All right, guys, so before we get into the search component, there's a little bit of cleanup that we're going to do here. So the fetch users function that we're calling inside of user results to display these users is basically just for testing purposes, right? There's no reason to display these particular users. I just wanted to have something in the state so that we could create our user results component and our user item component. Now, I realized that in our initial state here, I set loading to true. So if we don't call this fetch users, which we're not going to, and I go ahead and reload here, you'll see that the loader is going to show because loading is set to true. And if we look in our component, if loading is set to true, it returns a spinner. So what we're going to do is set that to false, and that should get rid of the spinner. But I do want to set the loading state to true right before we make any request, just like down here when we make our fetch users. So we would want to set it to true here before we make the request. It gets set back to false in the reducer, right? So what I'm going to do is add another case here. So let's say case, and if the action type is set underscore loading, then we want to return our current state. So we want to just spread across the current state and then set loading to true. All right, so whenever you want to set anything in your state, you use a reducer. So we're going to have this set loading that we can then dispatch. So in our context, I want to dispatch that here, although I'm going to be using that set loading in a few different places. So what I'll do is create a function specifically for that. So let's say set loading, let's say const set loading, and all we want this to do is dispatch, and we just want to dispatch an object with the type of set underscore loading. Okay, so then wherever we want to set loading, we just call that function, and I'm going to do that right here. So we can just call set loading. All right, so now if we were to call fetch users, we should have the same result that we had before. We see the loading. All right, now, like I said, I don't actually want to do this. We don't need to fetch users. So in the user results component, we can now get rid of the entire use effect. We don't need to bring in this fetch users. We can get rid of that. We don't even need use effects. We can get rid of that. So we can save that, and now we shouldn't see any users. Okay, and the reason we're not is because there's no users in our state, right? We're not calling fetch users anymore. So this whole function, this fetch users, let's just say get initial users, but I'm also going to put in testing purposes because we're not actually doing anything with these users. Ultimately, we'll have a search users that, when we submit our form, it'll get those users and put them into this state instead of just fetching random ones. All right, so I just wanted to take care of that real quick before we work on our search. So in the next video, we're going to start on the user search component. Okay, so now that we've basically emptied our user state, so we have nothing displayed here. Now we want to create our search form because ultimately we want to search for something and then have those user results display. So let's go into components and then users, and let's create a file here called usersearch.jsx. And we'll create a component, and just for now, let's just say search. And then where we want to bring this into is our home page. So if we go to pages and then home JSX, let's go ahead and copy this down, and we'll change this to user search. Change this to user search. And then we want to replace our comment here with user search. Okay, so we'll save that. We should just see this displayed on the page. Now, we're going to have quite a few classes and stuff because I want to make this look pretty decent. So let's start off by just adding all of our classes and all that, just to get it looking nice. So this is going to use the grid, and what we're going to have in the grid is basically just the search form with the button is one item, and then we're going to have a clear button as well. And we want that clear button to show when users are displayed, so if we want to clear that state, we can. Okay, if we want to clear up those users. So we're going to have a few classes here. Let's do grid. Let's do grid calls 1. And so that's going to be for small screens. And then let's do extra large screens. We'll do grid calls 2. We're also going to do on large screen, grid calls 2. And on medium, same thing. I'm going to do grid calls -2. And then let's add some margin here. I'm going to do MB-8. Oh, and some grid gap. So we're going to do gap-8. And I think that should do it as far as those classes go. Now, within that div, we're going to have a div that has the form. Okay, that'll be one grid item. And then we're also going to have the clear button. So here, let's create, actually, let's put this in a div. So we have these two divs for grid items. This one's going to have the clear button. So this is going to have btn. Let's do btn dash ghost, and then let's do btn dash large. And this is just going to say clear. Now in this div is where our form's going to go. So let's go ahead and add that. We'll do all the events and stuff after. I basically just want to get this displayed on the screen. So we'll have a class of form control here. And then inside form control, we're going to have a class of relative to position this relative, and have an input. So this input is going to have a class of w-full, so width full. We're also going to do padding right 40. We're going to do bg-gray-200, class of input, and a class of input-lg. These are Daisy UI classes, and then text-black. So we can save that for now. We'll just make this a little bigger. Let's see, that should be bigger. Input, oh, I forgot the dash, so it should be input-lg. So let's also add a placeholder. We'll just say search. And then let's add, you know what, we'll do the value and the on change. We'll do that after. So let's go under the input and let's have our button. And this is going to have some classes on it as well. We want to position this absolute, okay, within the relative div. And let's do top 0, right 0. And let's do rounded dash L dash none. So we don't want rounded corners on the left because it's going to basically look like it's attached to the input. Let's do a width. Let's do W-36, BTN, and BTN-LG. Okay, and then in here we'll just say go. And let's make sure that we make that a submit. So we want to add type submit. All right. So there we go. Good. And the clear button will go on the bottom. It's only one column on small screens. So let's see, the next thing we'll do is add the state for the input. Remember, when we have a form, usually your form inputs are going to have their own state, their component level state. So let's bring in up here the use state hook. So we're going to bring that in from React. And then let's go right here and let's say const. We're going to have this, we'll just call this text and then set text and set that to use state. And then the default is just going to be an empty string. Okay, and then for the text input here, let's have the value. And the value is going to be that text value. And then we also need an onChange, because when we update, when we type in the input, that's going to call this onChange event or onChange handler. And then the function will call handle change. Okay, and then we'll go up here and we just need to define handle change. And that's going to take in an event param. And all we need to do here is update that piece of state, which is text. So we want to set text to whatever is typed in, which we can get with e.target.value. Okay, so let's just open up our console and make sure we have no weird errors. And as we type, that should update the component state. We can check that here. So if we look at user search, you can see that the state is whatever is being typed in. All right, good. Now let's add, we'll do the onSubmit now. We're not going to do the actual search yet. We'll do that next. But let's add the onSubmit to the form, and we'll set that to, let's say, handle submit. And then we're going to go up here and create that function. Let's say const handle submit and pass in our event. Okay, now since it's a form submit, we have to do e.prevent default. And we'll just do just a little bit of validation here and just make sure something is there. So let's say if text is equal to nothing, then ultimately I want to have a custom alert, because I want to create another context for alerts. But right now we'll just use window.alert. So let's say please enter something, and then we'll just have an else. Then we want to search for the users. I'll just put a comment here. We'll say to do search users. And then let's set text back to empty. All right, so if we come over here, if I have nothing in here and I click, we should get an error. And if I do submit something, it's just going to clear up. But ultimately, we want to search users, which is going to happen in our context. Now, one last thing I'd like to do in this video is the clear. I only want to show that if there's users in the state. Right? If there's actually users being shown. Otherwise, there's no reason to show it. So in addition to use state, let's bring in use context, because we want to have access to the users array in the state to see if it's empty or not. And then let's bring in our GitHub context. Okay, so we're going to bring that in, and then let's go right here and let's say const, and then whatever we want to destructure from use context, and then pass in our GitHub context. And what I want to pull out of there is users. Okay, and then let's go down here, and I only want to show this div right here with the button. I only want to show that if there's actually users. So I'm going to go right above it and open up some curly braces and say users.length. So if that is greater than 0, then I want to show this div. So I'm going to grab this, cut that, and we'll put this in parentheses. Okay, so let's save. And now that clear button isn't going to show because there's no users in the state. And we'll get to the clear button functionality later on. In the next video, what I want to do is actually search users. When we go ahead and type something in here, we'll have a function in our context that will make a request to search from the GitHub API and then put it in the user state. Okay, so now we want to make our form work. We've created it, it's displayed, we can submit it, although right now it's not doing anything. What we want to do is go into our context. So we'll open up our GitHub context, and we need to create a function that will hit the search endpoint. If you remember, actually I'll just open up Postman, but if you remember when we looked at the API, we can do GitHub API github.com/search, and I actually have it right here, /users, and then we can add on a query param of Q and set that to whatever we want to search. So whatever we type in the form is what we want to put in that query param. But this is the endpoint that we want to hit. So I think what I'm going to do here is just copy fetch users. In fact, you know what? We don't really need fetch users anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of it. Let's just put a comment here, and we'll say get search results. And we're going to change fetch users to search users just to avoid confusion. Now we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to set loading, right? Then we're going to make our request, except now we don't want it to /users. We want it to /search users. So let's do let's close this. So /search /users, and then we want to do and then we want the query param. And what we can do here is just create a variable called params. And let's set that to new. And we're going to use URL search params. And we can pass in an object here. And let's say Q. And we want to set that to the text. Now text is going to come in from here. Okay, when we call search users, we're going to pass whatever the text is, which is whatever we type in, and then we want to create a new URL search params and set Q to that, and then we can just simply add on to this at the end, users, and then question mark, and then just put params like that. Okay, and we're going to still send the GitHub token just like that. Now what this returns, actually let me show you real quick. Let's take a look at what this returns. So we get an object, we get things like the total count, the incomplete results, but the items array is what we want. So instead of just setting data right here, what we're going to do is destructure from the object that's returned. We want to get the items array. And then what we'll do is we'll still dispatch get users, but we're going to pass in items as the payload. Okay, and if you remember, if we look in our reducer, so get users is just going to set users to whatever that payload is, and of course set loading to false. So we can keep this at get users, that's fine. So we'll go ahead and save that. Now it says fetch users is not defined, and that's because down here we're passing fetch users. We don't want to do that. However, we do want to pass in search users so we can access that from anywhere we want. In this case, we're going to go back to our user search, and then we're already getting the users from the context. So now let's, in addition to that, let's get search users. All right, and then let's go down here. So where we have this to do right here, this is where we want to actually call that. So let's get rid of this and let's call search users, and that's going to call the function that's in the context, and we're going to pass the text in. Okay, and then that should fill the user state, and we should see them appear here. So let's save, and let's just search for something. There we go. So we can go ahead and search for anything we want. Now, this clear button, I want that to clear the user state, which will then clear all of these users in the UI. So we're going to get to that next. All right, guys, so now we want to make the clear button work. So if we search, I want to be able to hit clear and just clear all of our results from our state. Now, what I'd like you guys to do if you want, of course, is to pause the video and try to do this on your own based on what you've learned so far. And just to kind of give you a couple hints, what you basically want to do is have a function in your context that dispatches an action to your reducer that just clears the users out of the state. Because remember, in our state we have users, which is an array. When we make a search, that array is full, but we want to dispatch an action that sets it back to an empty array. Then you want to bring that function into your component, into the user search component from the context, and you want to call it when you click and fire that off. Okay, so given those hints, go ahead and pause the video and give it a shot. So now I'm going to do just that. I'm going to go to my context, and let's put this, we'll just go above the set loading, and let's say clear users from state. And we'll have a function, let's call it clear users. Okay, and then all I want this to do is dispatch an object, and we want to have a type in here, and for the type, let's say clear underscore users. Okay, then we'll go to our GitHub reducer, and let's create a case here for clear users. And what we want to do is return, for our state, we're going to return the current state, but we also want to set users, we want to set that to an empty array. Okay, so we're clearing that user state. Let's save that. Now, this clear users, we want to make available to our components, so let's pass it in here as a value. Then we'll go to our user search, and from here we want to pull clear users from our context. And then down here where we have the clear button, let's go ahead and add an event handler here. So we'll do on click, and what we want to set this to is clear users, which we brought in from our context. So now if I come over here and click clear, it's going to clear up our state. Okay, so clear, good. So hopefully the whole process of how this works is becoming more clear. Basically, you have these functions in your context that will dispatch some kind of action to your reducer. Your reducer looks at that action, updates the state, and then any components that use any part of that state are going to react to it. Okay, so we have one single source of truth for our state. We also have these functions that you can pass down and call from any component that you want. So hopefully that's clear, or that becomes more clear as we move along. All right, so let's jump into the next video.